just realized I don't know the book. Hi everyone, thanks for coming out. One of the things I've discovered going on book tour, which I've done a bunch of times, but well, it goes back to when I was a kid. When I was 13 years old, and I was 12 actually, and I was getting ready to have a bar mitzvah, my mom would not let me get up from the dinner table until I had practiced my speech. You have to give a speech. So I'd stay at the dinner table every night and I'd give this speech, and my brothers and sister would get up and leave, and I'd be sitting at the table, and she would drill me on the speech, and I'd read the speech, and she would tell me to enunciate and speak more clearly and all that. And then I got to the big day, and I gave the speech, and when it was over, and I did, by the way, a very good job, and when it was over, I came down, and then she gave me a hug, and she whispered in my ear, you know, it sounded too rehearsed. You know, if your mother's Jewish, you'll know what I mean. So that was the last time I ever planned in advance anything to say, which is true. And so it's, you know, I kind of make it up as I go along. But this is still the first week. The book came out last Tuesday, so I'm still kind of figuring out what there is to talk about here. The book was supposed to come out about a year to a year and a half ago. My last book came out in 2009, and this book was supposed to come out. And you know, when a book comes out, you've written it like a year before that. It takes 9 months to a year for the book to work its way through the publisher. Editing, copy editing, cover art, marketing, sales, the whole thing. So this was supposed to come out a year and a half ago, but they couldn't release it, largely because I hadn't written it. I just, you know, you go through phases as a writer where you just don't feel like writing what you're supposed to write, and my last book had done sort of ridiculously well for me, and that played with my head a lot, and I just felt like, you know, how do I do that again? So you start reverse engineering that book, and you're like, well, what are the aspects of that book that people love, and let me see if I can do that again. And I really probably wasted a year doing that, and then realized, you know what, I got to do the exact opposite and not try to write anything like that book. And that's what I ended up doing, but it took me a really long time to arrive at that conclusion. So this book is a bit different. If you've read my other books, I tend to write about families, but usually through the point of view of a man who is going through, you know, some shit. And then I write about these men and their families and their relationships, and sort of a moment in their lives where it's all kind of going wrong, and you know, kind of follow them on this journey where they're trying to figure out, you know, who they are and what they could do about it. This book is not like that. This book is about a man when it's way too late for him to fix his moment of crisis. We get to him about 10 years later, after his life has been thoroughly screwed up for 10 years, and there's no going back and fixing it. I was really interested in writing about a guy who can't save himself, for whom redemption is no longer a possibility. Or I shouldn't say redemption is no longer a possibility, but fixing it is no longer a possibility. I wanted to sort of figure out what redemption looks like when it's too late to go back and fix your mistakes. So there is a strong undertone of regret, and trying to understand, you know, how people process regret when, you know, we all have regrets as we go through life, and some of us can do something about them, and then sometimes, you know, there's nothing to do but live with them, and that was kind of what I wanted to write about, which I know sounds really uplifting, but it actually, I started thinking about lonely people. There was a guy, I mean, every book starts from somewhere. I was watching a guy in a pizza store in my neighborhood, and you know, he was sitting there, and he was, I don't know, he was probably about 45 years old and a little bit overweight, and looked like he didn't shave with a mirror, and he had his jeans tucked into high tops that were probably cool in 1985, and you know, he was sort of slovenly, and he was like, he had his pizza in one hand, he had a crappy book in the other hand, and he had his MP3 player on, and you could tell looking at this guy that he didn't benefit from the input of other people in his life. And I thought it was kind of sad, but it's, and I just started thinking about this guy, and I wondered, like, where does he go home? What kind of little apartment does he go home to? What's his life about? Because he doesn't seem to have a life that has people in it. And at the same time, I figured he wasn't always like that. He was part of a family. Somebody gave birth to him. Like, what were the things that happened along the way that put him in this place where he's kind of practically talking to himself over his pizza? And so I started thinking about this character, and ultimately the character who emerged was the character I wrote about here, named Silver. And it just became, something fascinating to me. I wanted to study sort of lonely people, but of course that's not where the book ended up, because none of my books actually ever end up where I intended them to go. And the other thing that really influenced this book was that when I was in LA with some friends, we stopped at a red light, and they pointed out this building next to the light, and they said, that's the building where all the Hollywood execs move when they're between wives. And so I got this picture in my head of, like, this, think of a dormitory, but the people have money. And I had this idea that it's like a wild and crazy place in there, so I got out of the car, and I went in there, and I actually spent, like, the next few days going there every day and just kind of hanging out in the lobby and watching it, and it was really the most pathetic place I'd ever seen in my life. And I just thought this is the perfect backdrop for a novel. So Silver became a divorced man who had been divorced for about 10 years and lives in the only apartment building in his neighborhood, and as such, it's the place where all the men go when they get kicked out of their homes. So it's an apartment, and these buildings exist, by the way, in a lot of neighborhoods, but it's just the building you have to go to if you're going to stay in your neighborhood, because it's the only place you can go and pay rent. You can't buy a second house. So that's what the book became about. And so the book is basically about a guy named Silver who was very briefly a rock star 10 years ago. He had a band that had one hit, and after the band fell apart, he never got over it, and that moment of stardom kind of wrecked him for the rest of his life, because nothing was ever good again, and that also wrecked his marriage, and he ended up spending the last 8 years living in this building, playing the drums in a wedding band, never really spending any time with his daughter, and that's when we meet him. And when we meet him, two big things are happening in his life that are going to kind of shake it up a little bit. The first is that his 18-year-old daughter, Casey, shows up to tell him she's pregnant right before she's supposed to head off to Princeton University. And then while he's dealing with that issue, he discovers he has what's called an aortic dissection, which is an aneurysm in your aorta that basically, the way you generally find out you have this is that you die of it, and then they open you up and say, oh, you have an aortic dissection, but you're dead. But once in a while, you can, if something else happens to you and they happen to MRI your chest, they can find it, and if they find it, they can go in and operate on it and fix it. And Silver makes the decision, once they find it, that he's not going to have the operation, that he'd rather just not. And he's going to spend whatever time he has till he drops dead trying to see his daughter through this crisis and maybe be a father to her for once in his life. The symptom that this dissection gives you when you're not addressing it is that until you die, you have little blood clots from your aorta that are randomly floating up into your brain, and every once in a while you have what are called TIAs, or transient ischemic attacks, and they're like little mini strokes, and they cause behavioral issues. And what's happened to Silver is that he has lost his ability to maintain his inner monologue. So he thinks he's thinking something, but he's actually saying it, which leads to some really interesting conversations. So what I'd love to do now is read you one little section, just to kind of give you an idea of who we're dealing with, and then I'll be happy to talk about this book, talk about other books I've written, talk about other books other people have written, whatever you want.